Okay, so we're in Luke chapter 23 this morning, and we have been going through the prophecies in the New Testament, and we're up to Luke chapter 23, two verses, verse 42 and 43, and the background or the context of this is that Jesus is being crucified at the time, and he makes a statement to the thief on the cross, which is a very incredible statement, and it's very helpful in many ways for us. And so Luke 23, verse 42 and 43, and he said unto Jesus, Lord, remember me when thou comest into thy kingdom. And Jesus said unto him, Verily I say unto thee, today shalt thou be with me in paradise. Now, everybody knows what a comma is, right? A comma is something that sets off a particular phrase or a clause in a sentence, and it's very helpful to give us some understanding to the sentence. And I think as we get into this, hey, Brother Kenny, how are you? Good to have you with us. As we get into this, I think you're going to understand how important a comma can be, because a comma can make a big difference in understanding. According to some people, not me, but according to some people, Jesus actually said, I tell you today, comma, meaning I'm telling you today that at some point in your future, you'll be with me in paradise. Of course, we read it, and it says, Verily I say unto thee, comma, today shalt thou be with me in paradise, meaning that on that very same day, that Jesus and the thief would be together in paradise. So it's amazing how a little comma can suddenly become so powerful, because in this case, it actually impacts doctrine. Now, there are those who believe in the doctrine of annihilation. Does anybody know what that doctrine teaches, the doctrine of annihilation? Yes.
Even that your soul basically gets destroyed.
All right, the doctrine of annihilation is that when you die, if you are not a Christian, that's it for you. Okay? There's no more for you. Now, some people take that to another step in that your soul actually goes to hell, where it is burned up and you're done at some point. Could be minutes, hours, days, weeks, years, I don't know. They never really define that. But that's basically called the doctrine of annihilation. There are others that hold to the doctrine of soul sleep. What is that? Soul sleep. Oh, same guy. You got all the answers this morning. Yes, sir.
You know that where the he says when you die, basically your soul goes basically to hibernation until the day of redemption, right? Where then everybody goes together.
Okay, so yeah, that's hibernation is a good word to use there, I guess. So the idea in soul sleep is that when you die, your soul just kind of waits around until Jesus calls you forth. And there usually with the doctrine of soul sleep, there's also the corresponding teaching that there is a general resurrection, and we all stand before God at the same time, and good people go to heaven, bad people go to hell, that kind of thing, okay? But this verse does not allow for annihilation, and it does not allow for soul sleep at all. Others take the comma, and I'll get back to that in a minute, but others take the comma and leave it right where it's placed in the King James Version, and we have no issues with it because we believe that Jesus is speaking of a time when the thief on that very same day would be with Jesus in paradise. Punctuation. Let's talk about punctuation for a moment, okay? Keep in mind that the original early Greek manuscripts had no punctuation, all right? The earliest known Greek manuscript, the earliest one that I know about, and I kind of researched this, I couldn't find anything earlier. The earliest one I know about is Uncial 087. Uncial means that all the Greek letters are written in capital letters and all the words are all run together, okay? But anyway, it's dated around 550 AD, so you're looking at 450 years after the first century, after the time of Christ. And that's when we begin to see punctuation in Greek manuscripts. So what does that mean? Dun, dun, dun,
Can you rephrase the question?
What does it mean if there is no punctuation in the original Greek manuscripts? The ones that Paul and Peter and John wrote, they didn't use punctuation. So what does that mean to us today? Yes. It was added later, meaning it was not inspired. Punctuation was not inspired. But does that mean that the punctuation wasn't understood? You understand what I'm saying? You take the Hebrew language, for example, and you can get Hebrew manuscripts of the Old Testament today that, of course, have been reprinted or an electronic copy or whatever. And those manuscripts do not have vowel points. All right? So you and I, because we don't speak Hebrew as our first language, would not necessarily know how to pronounce a particular word that we were not familiar with. Okay? You can go to Israel today, and you're going to find that in Israel today, most of the Hebrew you'll see written all over the place does not have vowel points. So how do you know how to pronounce a word like SLM, for example? SLM, you might look at that and you might think Salem. But actually, if a person who is familiar with Hebrew looks at that, they're going to say Shalom, because they know. So the vowel points might have been added later, but that doesn't mean that they weren't inferred. That doesn't mean that people didn't understand what it was supposed to say. All right? It's the same thing with punctuation. Even though the punctuation wasn't necessarily there, everybody knew that that particular function of the comma or whatever was still to be there. Okay? So don't let that throw you. The punctuation is not inspired, but it's not arbitrary either. All right? It's not like somebody came along and said, well, let's just throw in some punctuation here. Okay? That's not what happened. In this case, in the verse that we're speaking of here, there's good reason to put the comma where it's at. All right? Can anyone think of any place anywhere in the Gospels where Jesus ever said, verily I say unto you today? No?
Only or you?
Yeah. Verily I say unto you today, come. Can anyone think of any place in the New Testament where Jesus ever said that? Okay, I use a little electronic version called eSword, and I did a little search, and I could not find one place where Jesus ever said, verily I say unto you today, come. In every case, 77 places, Jesus says, verily I say unto you, comma, and then he goes on. Okay? So, if the comma goes after the word today, in this case, that would be extremely unusual. All right? To the point where, I just struggle with believing that it would ever even be that way. Not to mention the structure of Greek language and, all of that to go along with it. So it'd be very uncharacteristic for Jesus to add today and say, verily I say unto you today. That would be very uncharacteristic of what we find throughout the New Testament. Therefore, Jesus specifically said, verily I say unto you, today shalt thou be with me in paradise. So Jesus specifically meant that the thief would be with him on that very day in a place that Jesus refers to as paradise. Well, now we have to discuss paradise. Because paradise, if you kind of study these kind of things, you're going to find out that people like to take the word paradise and make it say lots of things. And some of them might be creditable and some of them not. But I want you in your mind to just think of paradise as Jesus said it and heaven to be fairly synonymous. Okay? The word paradise is a transliteration from the Greek word paradisos. Or paradisos, actually, is how I think it would be pronounced. It's only found in 3 passages. So we've got this one here and we've got 2 more. So let me pass those out. Kenny, you take 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 4. And brother, you take Revelation chapter 2, verse 7. You answered a couple of good questions, so we'll skip you, okay? So 2 Corinthians 12, verse 4.
How that he was caught up into paradise and the unspeakable words which is not lawful for man.
Okay, same Greek word. Paul writes about a man, I believe he's referring to himself, that he says was caught up to paradise. This was well after the crucifixion, well after the resurrection, well after the ascension. Okay? And he uses the same Greek word to refer to this place where he saw unspeakable things it's not lawful for a man to be uttered. And we instinctively, as we read through that, know that he is referring to heaven. Okay? Revelation chapter 2, verse 7.
He that hath an ear, let him hear what the Spirit saith unto the churches. To him that overcometh will I give to eat of the tree of life, which is in the midst of the paradise of God.
Now that's an interesting verse because you can skip over to the end of the book of Revelation, which we won't do now. But it's in Revelation chapter 21, I think it is, maybe 22, where we find the tree of life, and it is in heaven. And so here in Revelation 2:7, written by the same person, John the Apostle, in the same book, we would naturally assume that it had the same meaning. And he uses this word paradise again to refer to heaven. I was reading, and there are various books on the Greek language and various different helps that you can use if you dabble in Greek at all. One book is written by a guy named Thayer, and I don't know his full name because everybody just calls it Thayer's. Okay? If somebody refers to Thayer's, they're talking about this particular Greek help. But he said this, and Thayer states that the Greek word is used to denote, quote, this is what he said, among the Persians, a grand enclosure or preserve, hunting ground, park, shady or well-watered place, in which wild animals were kept for the hunt. It was enclosed by walls and furnished with towers for the hunters. A garden, pleasure ground. The part of Hades, which was thought by the later Jews to be the abode of the souls of the pious until the resurrection, but some understand that this is to be a heavenly paradise, the upper regions of the heavens. According to the early church fathers, the paradise in which our first parents dwelt before the fall, Garden of Eden, still exists, neither on the earth nor in the heavens, but above and beyond the world, heaven. So Thayer points out the history of the Greek word itself, but also the Christian use of the word, and he points out that the early church writers believed that it was in heaven, and that Eden does not exist on earth, and it's actually now, I guess, in heaven, according to the way some of them believe. So that's quite a mouthful. To try to sort through all that Thayer said in your mind, that's quite a mouthful. To sum it up, paradise is the garden of God, a place of tranquility, peace, joy with the Lord. What do we call this place? Okay. Used to be. What do we call it now?
Heaven.
Heaven. All right. So when you read the word paradise, just think heaven, because that's what we're dealing with. There's some discussion of Jesus dying and going to preach to the spirits which are in prison, and that the place hell, or Hades, or however you want to see that, was divided into two. There was the place of torments, and then a great gulf, and then Abraham's bosom. But as that theory goes, when Jesus resurrected, he closed Abraham's bosom. And the thought behind that is that before the blood of Christ was shed, sins could not have been cleansed. So in the Old Testament, their sins were not cleansed, and yet they were saved. So they could not go directly into heaven because their sins had not been cleansed yet in time. So when Jesus died on the cross, their sins were cleansed. And so Abraham's bosom was closed, and everybody got to go up to be with the Lord in heaven. Okay? There's not a lot of scripture on that. You can't really, you just kind of piece things together, come to that conclusion. So I'm not saying that that is an actual fact. I'm just saying that's what some people think. But for you and I, it doesn't matter. Because even if that were true, that place, Abraham's bosom, is not there now. So when you and I die, where do we go? Heaven. All right? That's where we go. The prophetic emphasis in this verse is simple. Jesus said to the thief on the cross, "Verily I say unto you, today thou shalt be with me in paradise," or "shalt thou be with me in paradise." So the prophetic emphasis is very clear. When I die, My body can go in the ground, depending upon how I die, I guess. But my soul goes immediately to be with the Lord in heaven. That's what Jesus said to the thief on the cross. All right. Any questions or comments on that? No? Good. Good. All right. So let's move on then to the book of John. Now remember, we are not really touching on every prophetic passage. We didn't do it for Mark and we didn't do it for Luke because a lot of it has been repeated already in Matthew. John is often referred to as the universal gospel because it has a broader aspect of reaching not only to the Jews but also to the Gentiles as well. The ministry of Paul to the Gentiles has been in full swing for a while by the time he wrote the Gospel of John. So the church is now a great big mix of Jews and Gentiles. So everybody is not thinking of just a Jewish Christianity. They're thinking of Jews and Gentiles in one body in the church. So when John writes his gospel, it's got a wider view. And yes, sir.
There's this beautiful text says that, like you said, John's gospel is very much influenced by his teaching.
John's gospel was very much influenced by Paul's teaching. Okay, let's discern what this means. This means that somebody read the book of John and they saw a lot of things in John that sounded like Paul's teachings. That's not abnormal considering that the same God gave them all. All right? So you remember, I tried not to say author when I'm referring to the writers of the books because the author of the Bible is who? God. It doesn't mean I'm totally consistent, but I tried, okay? The author of the Bible is God, but he used various writers. It's just like when you use a notebook. Most people don't do that nowadays because we have iPads and, cell phones and that sort of thing. But, back in the old days when people carried actual notebooks, you could use various pens or pencils to write depending upon what you were going to use at that available time. And so you would have your words, your meaning, running through the notebook, but in various colors or shades, or maybe pencil in one place or pen in another. So I like to think of the writers of the Bible as being kind of like pens. You can see the red from the red pen, but it's still the words of the author, who is in this case me, but in the case of the scriptures it would be God. So I don't find it at all strange that John sounds a lot like the writings of Paul. I don't think John sat down and said, let me go through the writings of Paul and write a gospel and keep some of this stuff in here. Under the inspiration of the Spirit of God, John wrote exactly, word for word, exactly what God told him to write. So that just kind of settles that. Does that answer your question?
So if John was written, like you said, it was written when Paul's ministry was already running?
Yes.
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 So that's why there's this coloration, because John speaks about being born again, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so does Paul.
Sure.
Right? He refers to that too.
Sure.
Right? So that's why there's this correlation.
Yes. So John is a universal gospel. Matthew wrote specifically with Jews in mind. That's why he has a lot of Old Testament references. John, however, doesn't have as many Old Testament references. I'm not saying he doesn't have any, but he doesn't have as many. Matthew makes reference at least 25 places where Jesus fulfilled Old Testament prophecy. I say at least because that's how many I was able to count. John, I counted, I came up to closer to 10. Okay, so you can see a very big difference between Matthew and John in that respect. Now, there are passages such as 1 John chapter 4, verses 1 through 26, which we won't read, but if you want to look there and see what it's all about, Jesus very clearly shows himself, proclaims himself to be the long-awaited Messiah, and actually uses the Old Testament to do so. But we're not going to be looking at fulfilled prophecy from the life of Christ. That's not what we're really looking at in this study. We're looking at things that are going to come from our perspective. Here we are today. Okay, so that's what we're considering. John's gospel is also interesting for numerous other reasons. For example, John started all the way back in eternity past. Nobody goes that far back. John does. He starts out by saying, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. So he goes all the way back to before time began. All right. The others don't. The others start in time at some point. It doesn't mean that the other Gospels do not teach the eternity of Jesus. They certainly do. But when John starts, he starts specifically that way. John never mentions hell. You can go through the Gospel of John and see that he doesn't mention hell. He doesn't mention repentance literally by the word itself. And yet the teachings are still there, still very clearly implied. He implies it in his teachings on future judgments and everlasting life, which of course, repentance is required to be saved. Anyway, moving on. So the Gospel of John is filled with references then concerning the eternal state of man, either in heaven or hell. Again, we're not going to be considering all of these passages except as they relate to other areas of eschatology, or else we'd end up doing a study of most of the book of John. So, with that, go to John chapter 1, verses 19 through 23. And we'll get into the first passage in the book of John. John chapter 1, verses 19 through 23. And it says this, "And this is the record of John, when the Jews sent priests and Levites from Jerusalem to ask him, 'Who art thou?' And he confessed and denied not, but confessed, 'I am not the Christ.' And they asked him, 'What then? Art thou Elias,' or Elijah? And he saith, 'I am not.' 'Art thou that prophet?' And he answered, 'No.' Then said they unto him, 'Who art thou? That we may give an answer to them that sent us. What sayest thou of thyself?' He said, 'I am the voice of one crying in the wilderness, make straight the way of the Lord, as said the prophet Isaiah,'" okay, or Isaiah, all right? So what makes this section prophetic? Well, there's a question posed in verse 21 concerning whether Jesus was Elijah, which bears direct influence on how we interpret other prophetic passages, specifically Revelation chapter 12. What's in Revelation chapter 12? It's okay to look. It's an open book question. What is in Revelation chapter 12 that would make us think of Elijah?
The two witnesses.
The two witnesses. Okay, so depending upon what you do with John, if you think John was Elijah, then you're not going to see Elijah in Revelation chapter 12. The prophecy would have already been fulfilled. But if not, then your interpretation could be different. And again, we'll get to Revelation. We'll probably spend a lot of time there. The whole book is prophetic. But if John the Baptist wasn't the Christ, then they wanted to know, was he Elijah? Why are they asking that?
There is a Old Testament prophecy.
Yes, there's an Old Testament prophecy. Does anybody know where the Old Testament prophecy is? Hey, brother, how are you? Where is that Old Testament prophecy about Elijah? Anyone other than Dion, who has answered all the questions this morning because he is a good student? No? Anybody need some help? I'll give you a hint. The word or the name of the book starts with Malachi. Okay? It's in the book of Malachi. It's in Malachi chapter 4, verses 5 and 6, right? And let's see, I already called on you to read. Brother Young, can you read those? Malachi chapter 4, verses 5 and 6.
"Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord, and he shall turn the heart of the fathers to the children, and the heart of the children to their fathers, lest I come and smite the earth with a sword."
So Malachi wrote this prophecy about Elijah coming. Malachi, by the way, wrote 400 years, roughly 400 years BC. Okay? So you had 400, what we refer to as 400 silent years before the coming of Christ. All right? So 400 years before Christ. And by the way, Elijah is already gone. He's been gone for a long time now. What happened to Elijah? How did he die? He what? God took him. He didn't die. He just got into a flaming chariot, and in the Jim's paraphrase version that translates into Corvette, he got into a flaming chariot, and God took him, and he's gone. That happened with Enoch. That happened with Elijah. Same basic idea, okay? And he was gone. So Elijah didn't really die. And yet, many years later, Malachi writes and says, Elijah's going to come. All right? So the Jews were waiting for that. So they asked John the Baptist this question, are you Elijah? They also asked him if he was a prophet, that prophet, a specific prophet referred to in Deuteronomy 18:15. And Allie, would you read that? Deuteronomy 18:15.
The Lord thy God will raise up unto thee a prophet from the midst of thee, and thy brethren like unto me, and to him ye shall.
So the Jews knew that there was going to be a special prophet that was referred to in the Pentateuch as that prophet. This was not going to be like the other prophets that came and went. This was going to be a specific, special prophet. And they also knew that Elijah was going to come from Malachi chapter 4, verses 5 and 6. So I want to read that again, and then we're going to talk about that a little bit more. But Malachi chapter 4, verses 5 and 6, behold, I will send you Elijah, the prophet, before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. And he shall turn the heart of the fathers to the children, and the heart of the children to their fathers, lest I come and smite the earth with a kiss. So this is how the Old Testament ends, with a prophet concerning Elijah, which is to come. So the Jews were looking for that prophet, and they were looking for Elijah. This is what they were expecting. So when John the Baptist comes along, and he is baptizing people into repentance, and he is preaching, so they come to him and they say, who are you? Are you that prophet? No. Are you Elijah? No. Well, who are you then? And he refers back to the Old Testament again, where he says, I'm the voice crying in the wilderness. I'm the one that says, prepare ye the way of the Lord, make his path straight. That's who I am. So he was definitely special, no doubt about it. But he was not that prophet, and he was not Elijah. Now go to Matthew 17. Matthew 17, verses 10 through 13. And let's see, let me get here. And his disciples asked him, Jesus' disciples asked Jesus, saying, why then say the scribes that Elias must first come? And Jesus answered and said unto them, Elias truly shall come and restore all things. Future tense from the time of Jesus. At this point, by the way, John the Baptist is dead. Okay? Verse 12, but I say unto you that Elias is come already, and they knew him not, but have done unto him whatsoever they listed. Likewise shall also the Son of Man suffer of them. Then the disciples understood that he spake unto them of John the Baptist. So two thoughts here that we have to reconcile. The thought in verse 11, Jesus says Elias is still coming. And then in verse 12, Jesus says, but Elias came already, and that was John the Baptist. So how do we reconcile these two thoughts? Well, Elias came in the spirit and the power of, let me back up, I said that wrong. John the Baptist came in the spirit and the power of Elijah. But he was not Elijah. All right? And Jesus clearly said he's not Elijah. Elijah is still going to come. All right? So Jesus said John the Baptist was not Elijah. And John the Baptist said, I am not Elijah. So what are we supposed to take away from this? That John the Baptist was not Elijah. Okay? Which means Elijah's still coming. He's still coming. So Malachi spoke of Elijah returning before the great and dreadful day of the Lord. All right? Both John the Baptist and Jesus made it clear that John was not Elijah that would come. John the Baptist came in the spirit and the power of Elijah, but apparently Malachi chapter 4, verses 4 and 5 is what we refer to as a double prophecy. In other words, there is 2 points of fulfillment. This is not odd, by the way. You see this in Bible prophecy a lot. So it's not too odd that you see a double prophecy pointing to both John the Baptist's ministry, but beyond that, and more specifically, to an even more future ministry of Elijah himself. All right? So this is what we have in John chapter 1, verses 19 through 23. Any questions on that? Yes, sir.
So then, very likely, Elijah will be one of the witnesses.
Maybe.
Possibility.
There's a possibility. I don't know.
But he still has to come again.
Yeah, I have my opinion on who the two witnesses are, but I'll save that to when we get to Revelation chapter 12. In my opinion, I don't think Elijah is one of them. But then again, if he's not one of them, how come he's not mentioned anywhere else in the book of Revelation, which is a blow-by-blow explanation of everything that's going to happen during the tribulation period? I don't have an answer for that.
And he still has to come again.
But he still has to come. All right? That's what we know. All right?
Can I ask some-
Yes, sir.
Here in Matthew 17:11, right?
Matthew 17:11.
Elias truly shall first come and restore all things.
Uh-huh.
Was that the first?
No, because Jesus says this during his earthly ministry, and he's speaking in future tense. So at this point, let's say it's 30 AD, just for the sake of argument. He's saying from this point in the future, 31, 32, 35, 257, 2020, 2051, or whatever it may be, in the future, Elias will come and restore all things.
Okay, but what is Jesus referring to here when he says he shall first come? First come before what?
Before him.
Before Jesus.
Yeah, so
Again.
yes.
And then when Elijah then comes before Jesus, he, Elias, will restore all things.
Yes.
He is
You would think that, well, actually that's an argument against him being one of the two witnesses, because the two witnesses do not restore all things. They die, they're left dead in the streets for three days. The world has a party. They give each other gifts because they're so happy that they're dead. And then the tribulation marches on, and things haven't been restored. In fact, they get worse for a time. Okay? So that would be an argument, and I never thought of that until just now, but that would actually be an argument against Elijah being one of the two witnesses.
but they get raised up again, right?
Yeah, they do get raised up again. And they come back again with him.
So,
I don't know. I'll let you know when it happens, though.
yeah.
I'll call you. I'll say, yo, Dion. I'll text you and say, yo, Dion, guess what? This is it.
Right. I'll be there.
Yeah. So, okay, let's move on to John chapter 1, verses 49 through 51. John chapter 1, verses 49 through 51. This is early in Jesus' ministry, and he is at this point gathering his disciples, of which they become, of course, his apostles. And so in John chapter 1, verses 49 through 51, he has met Nathanael. And Nathanael answered and said unto him, Rabbi, thou art the Son of God, thou art the King of Israel. I always like that verse because you've got three titles there for Jesus. Nathanael calls him Rabbi, which means master or teacher. Then he calls him the Son of God. What a way to start. Thou art the Son of God, thou art the King of Israel. Looking at his prophetic title as the King of Israel, as we know, the King of Kings. And so this is what Nathanael says to Jesus. And then Jesus answers, in verse 50, Jesus answered and said unto him, Because I said unto thee, I saw thee under the fig tree, believest thou? Thou shalt see greater things than these. And he saith unto him, Verily, verily, I say unto you, comma, note today, did you notice that? Hereafter ye shall see heaven open, and the angels of God ascending and descending upon the Son of Man. Boy, that's, you read that and you go, he's going to see the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man. It makes your mind spin, and you're trying to figure out where that's going to happen and when that's going to happen and all of that. Nathanael makes some very powerful statements here concerning Christ. So, without hesitation, he assigns to Jesus two of the highest messianic titles. Son of God, King of Israel. All right? These are two of the highest messianic titles. There were actually quite a number of Jews who were anticipating the Messiah's arrival. They were waiting for it. A good number of Jews were doing that. You could go back to Luke. You don't have to turn there now, but just to give it to you. In Luke chapter 2, We had the story of when Jesus goes to the temple and he meets an old lady there. What's her name? Anna. Yeah. And then there was also another guy. Anybody remember his name? What?
Simeon.
Yeah. So they both are making statements concerning how they believe that this baby is the Messiah, is the Christ child. So there were people looking for him. And of course, in John chapter 1, verse 45, again, a statement made concerning Christ being the Messiah. So people were looking for it. You know, some people were. Those that were in tune with God and his plan, and they knew of the scriptures, they were looking for the Messiah to come. And so Nathanael just jumps right out there, day one, first meeting with Jesus. They're like 2 minutes into their meeting, and he says, "You're the Son of God. You're the King of Israel." So Nathanael gets off to a really good start as a disciple. And we know from statements that Jesus made later in the Gospels, as well as how the story of Christ's earthly ministry plays out, that although Jesus is the king, he's the king right now, by the way, he did not come to establish an earthly kingdom. Did he? For had he come to establish an earthly kingdom, he would have established an earthly kingdom. But that was not the purpose of his earthly ministry, his first coming. What was his purpose?
To save the lost.
To seek and to save the lost. All right? That's what he came for. He spoke of doing the will of the Father. The will of the Father was that he would die for sinners. That was his first coming. Now, he is going to establish an earthly kingdom, just not yet. Okay? So understand that the phrase King of Israel, that is really kind of a synonymous phrase with King of the Jews. All right? And it's a phrase that's used by all the gospel writers as they describe Jesus' trial before Pilate. And so let's look at these places here. I'm going to pass this out. Let's see. Cheyenne, you didn't read, right? I want you to take, wow, all of these sections are kind of long. So I'm going to just pick on you anyway. Matthew 27, you're going to read verses 11 through 14. And then Kenny, I'll start with you again. You take Mark 15, verses 1 through 5. You take Luke chapter 23, verses 1 through 4. You have John chapter 18, verses 28 through 37. Okay? So Matthew 27, verses 1 through 11 through 14. Was that through verse 14? Okay. So, are you a king? Yes. Thou sayest it, by the way, is a polite way of saying yes. All right? Mark chapter 15, verses 1 through 5. Who got that? Okay.
Very early in the morning, the chief priests held a consultation with the others and scribes and the whole council and bound Jesus and carried him away and delivered him to Pilate. And Pilate asked him, "Art thou the king of the Jews?" And the answer said unto him, "Thou sayest it." And the chief priests accused him of many things, and he answered nothing. And Pilate asked him again, saying, "Answerest thou nothing? Behold, how many things they witness against you?" But he answered nothing before that Pilate.
All right. So, again, the question is asked. We had it in Matthew. We got it in Mark. Now in Luke chapter 23, verses 1 through 4.
And the whole multitude of them arose and led him unto Pilate. And they began to accuse him, saying, "We found this fellow perverting the nation and forbidden to give tribute to Caesar, saying that he himself is Christ the King." And Pilate asked him, saying, "Art thou the King of the Jews?" And he answered him and said, "Thou sayest it." Then said Pilate to the chief priests and to the people, "I find no fault in this man."
All right. So, again, Matthew mentioned it. Mark mentioned it. Luke mentioned it. And then John chapter 18, verses Wow, 28 through 37. Just get down past the question. You can stop after that. Okay.
From 28 until the end of the question.
Yeah.
Starting in verse 28, then led they Jesus from Caiaphas unto the hall of judgment. And it was early, and they themselves went not into the judgment hall, lest they should be defiled, but that they might eat the Passover. Pilate then went out unto them, and said, What accusation bring ye against him, against this man? They answered and said unto him, If he were not a malefactor, he would not have delivered him up unto thee. Then said Pilate unto them, Take ye him, and judge him according to your law. Then the Jews therefore said unto him, It is not lawful for us to put any man to death, that the saying of Jesus might be fulfilled, which he spake, signifying what death he should die. Then Pilate entered into the judgment hall again, and called Jesus, and said unto him, Art thou the king of the Jews?
There you go. So again, all four gospel writers mention how Jesus was before Pontius Pilate. All four gospel writers mention how Pontius Pilate asked him the question, Are you the king of the Jews? That was a very important point, a very big stickler, if you will, with the trials of Jesus. Are you the king of the Jews? Going back to our text, Jesus also mentions the angels ascending and descending. I'm not sure that there is any direct correlation, but Jesus refers to angels in relation to his coming in numerous places. And we're out of time, so we'll have to come back to that thought next week. So we'll stop there. Any other questions? Yes.
So the Old Testament scriptures in many places are prophesying of a Messiah, a king that's going to establish an earthly kingdom. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's why the Jews called him a king, because that's what they're looking for.
Yes. Yes.
Because the church, the age of grace, the church was a mystery at that time.
Yes. All right. Any others? Okay, then let's go ahead and close in prayer. Brother Young, close us in prayer, and you right here, and then we'll be dismissed.
Thank you, Father, for today. For being